Thank you, everyone, for coming today. My name is Doreen Benyamin. I'm a 3L here at Columbia Law School. And today, we all have the honor of having Hilary Krane join us. She's currently actually a lecturer in law at CLS. She just finished teaching a course. And she's only here for 2 more days, right?
Right.
So we're really happy to have her before she leaves. So a little bit about Hilary's career. So she had an illustrious career since graduating from Stanford for college and the University of Chicago for law school, where she was a member of the Law Review. After graduating, Hilary clerked at the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, followed by working at Skadden, where she specialized in complex commercial and securities litigation. After Skadden, Hilary joined PricewaterhouseCoopers as partner and assistant GC, and Levi Strauss as GC and senior vice president for corporate affairs, both of which were positions that resulted in pay cuts in her salary, but ultimately led her to her position today as General Counsel of Nike. So maybe we can was that all good?
Yeah, that's all good. That's me in a nutshell.
Maybe we can just start there. I think it was really interesting, the fact that you were deciding to take these positions where you were taking a pay cut from what you had done before. How did you go about thinking about that and reasoning through that it made sense for you as a career?
So in kind of every career move I've made has been mostly driven by people and the substance of the work. And I've let that really guide me. And at the time that I was at Skadden, that was top dollar private firm experience. So it was like either I was going to stay doing exactly that, or at some point, if I wanted to broaden out into my future, I was going to decide to do something else, and that could have economic consequences. And it did. At the time, even before I was considering going to Pricewaterhouse, I was looking at a couple of other firms in the Bay Area, and for all of them, they were beneath the New York Skadden standard. So it was just a reality. But at the time, it was right for me to leave, and I wanted to go do the work at PwC. They were doing litigation in-house. The accounting firms are where corporate America speaks to the public and through numbers, and so it was really related to the work I had been doing, and it seemed like a great opportunity. So I guess I just didn't really overthink it. I thought of my career as like it was going to be a long thing, and the ultimate goal of it was not top dollar. It was interesting work that I could learn from and be challenged while I supported my family. So it just didn't seem like money should be the be-all and end-all of every work decision, and so I didn't let it become that.
That's awesome. Also, I just wanted to clarify, so this is interview format, but you guys are also welcome to ask questions throughout, not just at the end. So if things come up that are related to what we're talking about or not, you're welcome to ask questions. And also, this will be posted on YouTube afterwards on a channel called Before You Take the LSAT. So I guess it's a really basic question, but I'm curious, just based on your experience, not a general definition, but how would you define what a general counsel is and does, based on your experiences at both Nike and Levi?
Yeah, so the general counsel is ultimately responsible for all of the legal matters in a company. They're also responsible for all corporate governance matters as it relates to the board and execution of the board responsibilities. At least most general counsels have at least that as the core of what they do. Key to those responsibilities is also you're an advisor to the CEO on anything the CEO wants advice to. You're generally, and I wouldn't take the job if this weren't the case, a member of the senior executive team. So you're involved in making all of the strategy for the company as an executive, in addition to being the company's lawyer. And so I sit at the table where we make all of our long-term strategic plans and indeed our annual plans. And so it's that whole spectrum. And then probably the most important and maybe most gratifying part, at least for me, because I've been in departments that had a number of people, is you're the leader of the legal team. And for me, that's always involved a global group of people who are providing services to the company all around the world. And I am helping them set direction and guiding them and creating a sense of team spirit and investing in their education and career development, because the people on the ground are actually the people who do the important work that make the company run. So those are the different aspects of the job.
How do you split your time between the legal department and working with the executive team? Like, what percentage would you say you spend with one versus the other?
Wow, that's really impossible to say. Every day is a different day. It depends on what's going on. There's sometimes when I go really deep because there's something legal going on and I'll lose myself in a legal issue for a couple of weeks. And there's other times where weeks on end I'm doing mostly business stuff. So it's very variable depending on what's going on at the company at any given moment.
Do you have like regular times that you meet with either group, or do you set aside time to meet with either group?
So again, my schedule is highly variable. There are set meetings that go on. Like we as an executive team have a regular cadence of strategic planning meetings. We have the CEO's direct reports. We meet as a team regularly, twice a month. My senior team and I usually meet at least once a week, and then I have one-on-one meetings with each of them. But then that's like what it is on paper. But then you wake up every morning and you come to the office and it's what's going on in the world. And so whether I'll attend those meetings or I'll cancel the things that I have in a given day, that's a daily event. I like to say it's the key part of my role is triage. It's just coming in the morning and deciding what's important and moving away the things that are less important to make room for the more important. And that's why I find it so hard to say, there's anything regular. These things are built in the schedule, but you can't always make them because your highest value is figuring out what needs to be done right now and making sure you create the space to do that.
Do you find that you enjoy or embrace the unpredictability of your job?
Oh yeah, I love that. I like things to be interesting. I'm good at prioritization. And I like the uncertainty of every day has something surprising around the corner. And I get enough continuity because of the people I work with. So I have real continuity in the relationships with my boss, my colleagues, my team who works with me, but not a whole lot of continuity in the content. And that's great because it makes for learning all the time, which I really appreciate.
So going back to your role as GC, so recently the CEO of Nike said that he would be stepping down in the coming months, which is something you knew for a while. How do you prepare yourself for that transition, and how do you think about your role during a time like that?
So I have known about this for quite some time. We just announced it a week ago, but like the General Counsel is an important role leading up to something like that and then following it. It's one of the boards really has two chief obligations. One is to direct the company's strategy, and the other is to prepare for succession of the CEO. So evaluating, appointing, and overseeing the CEO is a clear part of the job. So making sure that the board had the right processes in place from a governance point of view as it considered the decision, and that we documented it appropriately in the corporate records to give everybody protection of the business judgment rule. These are the technical things you do as a lawyer to get ready. You're involved in negotiating the contract with the incoming executive because that's an important corporate document. You're preparing and helping with the PR and the HR team. You're helping prepare the public announcements, the 8K filings, the securities grants. There's all sorts of things that you have to do just to get ready to drop. So that all ended last week. And now comes the time where you really think about how do you be useful to a CEO who's onboarding. We're very lucky because ours comes from our board. So he's served on the board for 5 years. He knows the company, and for that reason has relationships with a set of executives at the top of the company, not deep in, but we all know him, and there's already a foundation of trust there because he's the CEO. But he'll have to learn a lot of details of the company. So now I'm turning back to my team, and I'm saying, imagine you have no time. You're coming into this huge, $40 billion company, and you got to get up to speed. I'm challenging each member of my team. What's your one page? Bring everything you do down to one page. the most important issues and then the routine issues, just so he knows where you are. And he then can say, I want to know more about this and that. So I'm thinking a lot about how do I create materials and help my team create materials that are accessible, educational, and give him enough insight to allow him to guide himself between what he wants to know more of. That's when it comes to the legal department. And then just as an overall executive, I'm thinking, what are the key issues I think he wants to be tuned into? What are the things, if I were in his position, I'd want to know? As the general counsel, you have an ability to talk very straight and directly because, you know, it's privileged, almost all of it. And then I think the last thing that I can do that's high on my list is making sure my team is focused and we keep delivering. Because as I think about him, I'm thinking he's got to learn our product line. He's got to meet with all of the athletes. He's got to learn the marketing. He's got to travel around the world. While I think the legal issues are super important, I'm the expert on that. And the best thing I can do is kind of keep things steady to create time for him to go and learn everything else he has to learn. So I think that's one of the biggest things we can bring is just, we know we can execute with excellence, keep things under control to give him a real sense of confidence and freedom to go out and do the rest of his job.
He was previously, the new CEO was previously the CEO of eBay, is that correct?
He was, he is currently the CEO of a company called ServiceNow, which is a cloud computing company. And before that, he was the CEO of eBay. And before that, he was the CEO of Bain.
So one of the talks that you did on campus, you were speaking about one of the issues that you've had to face as like a legal department, but also as a business decision. And you were talking about going direct to consumer.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, how you deal with an issue like that, where people have all these different opinions about how you should move forward with something that's very different from the way things have been done. Like he has never really sold through Amazon or any of those types of online platforms.
Yeah, so right now I think for everybody who's in the retail world, the question of your own retail, bricks and mortar, your own .com, multi-party retail, like so, you know, imagine Foot Locker online, okay, selling Adidas and Puma and Nike, like you have all that. And then you go to the big platforms like Amazon or Alibaba in China, which is super huge, Tmall. And you know, really, really difficult questions there because those platforms are better and worse at keeping counterfeit goods off of their site, of not selling infringing products, of taking the data and using the data of the brands that they sell in order to educate themselves and offer competing products. So it's a complex environment and figuring out what the right balance is. So we're in a pilot with Amazon now, and we're kind of seeing how it's going. You know, we're learning. But there's upsides and downsides to all of these organizations, and we've engaged a lot. We've engaged a lot with the platforms to try to improve the online experience, and we have better and worse results with some than with others. And you really have to think about your brand. Nike's a highly premium brand. Like, how do we want to be presented online? We know how we do it. We don't necessarily think that everybody else in the world does it in a way that is consistent with our brand attributes. And so we've got to decide to distribute based on that. It's really, really hard work.
So you've mentioned that one of your favorite books is Being Wrong. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious, how do you think about disagreeing without being, how do you disagree without being disagreeable?
So I have a lot of practice.
And part of the reason, as this follows up with the last thing, because you had mentioned that there was a lot of, well, there wasn't necessarily agreement on whether or not to use platforms like Amazon.
Yeah, and so there still isn't. I think every company in our position is having debates all the time as as facts on the ground change, what are the right business relationships? And like, look, this has been going on for a long time. There was a period in the early 2000s, I think, before I was there, that Nike pulled everything out of Foot Locker, decided that it didn't like the way Foot Locker was behaving as a partner, and it pulled everything and then renegotiated and came back into it. And so this is a new technology, but an age-old problem. As for being wrong, okay, there's this great book, Catherine Schultz wrote it, Being Wrong, Adventures in the Margin of Error. It's awesome. And mostly because it reminds us all that we're all wrong a lot of the time, but nobody assesses themselves as being wrong a lot of the time. You know, no, I'm right 80% of the time. Well, if the average person is wrong 80% of the time, and we all think we're right 80% of the time, well, clearly we're all wrong all the time, okay? And so it's just a really good thing to always have in mind, no matter how strong your conviction, you may actually not be right. And that should challenge you to dig deeper, to listen to other people. Law school kind of taught me, if somebody disagrees with me, how to win the argument. And my mother used to tell me, just because you win every argument doesn't make you right. And I'm like, well, I don't know, it's working for me. But I think there's something to that. And with time, I've learned that. And it's important in developing the skill to how to disagree without being disagreeable, because the most disagreeable thing is somebody who's arrogant and won't listen. That is no good. It excludes people. You can't create an inclusive environment. Not all the voices at the table get heard. So you always have to, in every conversation, I'm open to the fact that I could be wrong. And I go into conversations asking people, instead of trying to tell them why I'm right, I ask them to help me understand why they think I'm wrong. Because if they can help me understand why they think I'm wrong, then I'll be able to better evaluate, maybe they're right. And if not, then I'm either more sure of my conviction, but at least we've had a dialogue. They've felt heard, I've felt heard, and then you just have to move on sometimes and make a decision. And sometimes you're wrong in those decisions, and that's life. You also have to learn not to beat yourself up. People are wrong. And so I think the best thing to do is remember that, and don't present yourself as somehow infallible, or that in order to be a good professional, you have to be able to answer every question right away with a definitive answer. That's just not how the world works. So, you know, be open to the fact, if you think you know something, say that. I say this all the time. My CEO will ask me a question. I'm like, that's a technical question. I will have to go get a technical answer. My gut tells me X. And so I'm going to bet we're going to find X. But you can't rely on that until I go do the work. And then I go do the work, and, you know, a fair amount of time it's X, and the other times I'm have to, like, good thing I told you I was going to check, not X. And he's like, no. And I'm like, no. And that actually increased trust, because I'm willing to say when I'm wrong. And I've left an opening to allow myself to go check and be right, instead of thinking that I'm going to look better, stronger, whatever, more confident if I just give an answer. Well, if I know it for sure, fine. But if I don't, in the end, you get called out for that. It's just not worth it.
I imagine, though, that that's something that your team knows and understands. But do you ever have issues with people who are not on your team and don't understand that culture and maybe get defensive or offended?
You know, you can always we have vigorous debate. And when you have vigorous debate, there's always risk that some people get put off on that. But I think we're pretty good at not being offensive. You know, everybody has a lot of mutual respect. And we operate as a principle, both on my team and the senior executive team I'm a member of, is you assume the good intentions of your colleagues. We're on a team. Just because we disagree, that doesn't mean that, like, we're against each other. We're all for what's right for the company. And sometimes, you know, it's a marketplace of ideas. Like, have it out. Who's got the better of it? And once you're heard, accept you've been heard. That's being included. That's an inclusive conversation. Nobody has a right to win. Everybody only has a right to have a seat at the table and have their voice heard. And once you've been heard, if you don't win the day, accept it and move on. You're not always going to win. And the worst, the most unattractive is going to try to prove the people who won right in order to make you look better. Like, nobody will ever want to work with you. Like, think about it. You got to have people who want to collaborate with you to make great things happen out there, and how you behave really makes a difference.
On that topic, do you think there's so many things that are important to being a GC? Would you say that emotional EQ, if that's also an important aspect?
Emotional intelligence is a huge part of being a successful professional, period. It's especially true for the General Counsel, because you have to be dealing with difficult, sensitive issues all the time. You often have to be telling people the news they don't want to hear. Sometimes you're having to make the decisions to fire people, and sometimes you're having to execute those decisions. Sometimes you have conflicting, sense of obligations, and this hasn't luckily happened to me, but in my current role, but I've seen it before, where there's a split between a board and a CEO, and the General Counsel, has to serve both. I was recently with a friend of mine who has my role at a different company, and their board decided to oust their CEO, so she's working with him every day. He hired her, right? And she's dealing with the chairman of the board and the nominating and governance committee, preparing for how they'll fire him, what that means. And she's showing up at work every day, advising him. And that's as hard as it gets right there. Trusted relationships all around, but you have a duty. And so that's another thing about being a General Counsel, is emotional intelligence really matters there. Discretion matters there. Self-control matters there. And not being overly emotionally invested matters there. Like, you, at a certain point, you have to act on the corporation. This woman has a lot of loyalty towards that CEO. So what? She couldn't let that influence one thing she did. She was there on behalf of the corporation. Those situations come up, and they require a fair degree of self-mastery, actually.
There are so many issues that come up as a GC, and if there's ever one that comes up for you that you're not sure how to approach, what resources do you reach out to? Is there like a group of GCs that keep in touch and help each other out, or what else would you look to?
Okay, so first of all, this is part of the reason that I spend so much time on my team and making sure I have a fantastic team. The people who report to me are among the smartest lawyers in the world. They have no problem disagreeing with me without being disagreeable, and sometimes even being disagreeable, but they won't let me be wrong. If they think I'm wrong, they're going to make sure I understand that. So they're my first line of defense. We're in it together. But I do have other places I go, including my colleagues sometimes, or the CEO for advice. I use all of those levers. I'm a member of a group called the Association of General Counsel, which is 85 general counsel from the top maybe 150 companies. It's an invitation-only group. It's not sponsored by any law firm or consultant. We pay for it ourselves, and there's an attendance requirement. The only asset the group has is that the general counsels actually show up to our meetings. And so we show up to the meetings, and you'll have at any given meeting, 70 of the top general counsel in a room. We meet twice a year, and that's just fantastic, because it's totally safe place. You're dealing with a lot of the same issues. You learn a lot, and you develop relationships. And I also was part of a group in the Bay Area. I'm still part of it, but I don't get to go much, of women who were general counsels of companies with over $1 billion in revenue. We self-organized maybe 15 years ago and just invited a group of us out to dinner. And we call it Dinner Among Friends. And we have 4 quarterly dinners, and just get together and talk about what's going on. And if I have a deep question, I can call one among them I trust. Sometimes I go out and I survey them, both groups. Do you guys have this policy? Have you dealt with that issue? And then I have my own trusted advisors, who are people I've known for a long time, who are lawyers, so I can share the privilege with them, and I'll seek advice from them. So I have a lot of different tools and places that I go to, and I benefit from them because it can be a lonely job. And that's where knowing other general counsels is really good, because they experience that same loneliness and in a way you can't talk about with your team.
What makes it a lonely job?
Well, it's the feeling that you have an obligation towards objectivity and making the hard calls that most of the other executives don't have. If something goes wrong, you have the investigative obligation. You have to tee up the facts. You sometimes have to tell people when really bad things have happened. You have to be prepared at any moment that you might have to fire one of your colleagues or be involved in a decision to do that, which is incredibly difficult. And you can't always share the facts of the things you're working on with your other colleagues. So you have to be secretive, because the privilege doesn't extend to the whole senior management team. It might extend to one person whose issue it is. But so I'd be working on an issue for months that none of my colleagues would know is even out there. So those things can contribute to the loneliness of the job within the organization.
So getting to where you are now in your career, I'm sure that there were a lot of challenges that also had to do with just being a woman. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the fact that you did have to grow a thick skin to be where you are now. Like, what was that process like, and how did you deal with it, excuse me, mentally, in terms of like, I'm sure it was hard, and how did you, excuse me, how did you think about it? And maybe also on the flip side, what were some of the advantages?
So it's super hard, because the only experience I have in life is as being a woman. So like everything, you know what I mean? It's really, it's hard to say. I think everybody who practices in this way needs to develop a thick skin. And I don't know if men come with that more naturally or not, but yeah, it took a period of time of unlearning some habits. There were a couple of times when job opportunities were put in front of me where somebody called me about the Levi Strauss job, my answer was literally to start with the list of qualifications that I didn't have for the job. And like I'm told by reading the research, that's a very female thing to do. I've spent my life trying to get over that. I kind of felt that I don't know if any of you have, but I have something called an imposter syndrome. Like, I can't believe I am where I am. It's like, surely they're mistaken and they're not talking about me. And I think part of dealing with that has been my own way, was to make sure I pointed out to everybody all of my weaknesses. So when they found them out later, it wouldn't be like I was hiding them. And I don't know where that comes from psychologically, but that's what I did. And over time, I'd say what I learned to do was lead with my strengths and not my weaknesses. My weaknesses are there. We just talked about being wrong. You have to own them. You have to be open to it. But over time, I learned, like, hey, how about you start with your strengths and you end with your weaknesses or gaps, instead of starting with the gaps and ending with the weaknesses. And boy, that transformed things, including my self-perception. Because when you actually sit down to go through the strengths, it's like, oh yeah, I do have a fair amount of this job. Why do I always focus on the gaps? So that's the most, based on the literature I know, gendered behavior that I've shown that I've had to really intentionally try to get over in the workplace. Like, yeah, I started in the 80s. There was a lot of crap out there, what women should wear, how you should look, Did you get your fingernails done? Oh, God, help me. I had 3 children at home. I could no more think about any of those issues. But there was a world out there that acted like you should have. Like, let's give you advice on how to dress. Men can just make their assumptions, but we'll give you, a handy little guidebook. And it's like, seriously, people? And that could, enough of that gets under your skin. But at the same time, I've been really fortunate. I don't feel like I've really lacked for opportunity in any way, even though I've been in some uncomfortable situations. And, you deal with it and you move on. Also, at a certain part of life, you just stop taking things personally. and just decide, like, I know what I got to do and I'm just going to do it. And I'm just going to start caring less how people react to me if I know I'm behaving in a way I feel comfortable with.
It was just funny because it just reminded me, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg talks about advice that she got where I think it was her mother-in-law told her, sometimes it's good to be a little deaf and just not hear things and ignore, it gets you far.
Yeah, some things, and I'm not, let's be totally clear, I'm not great at that. Somebody says something that I don't appreciate, and I tend to like to share my point of view. And so figuring out how to do that in ways to help other people learn, because a lot of times people don't even know they're being offensive. Like they don't even know that they're behaving in a way, that they're talking over you. Or for sure, I've been many, many, many times in the situation where I say something and 10 minutes later, a guy in the room says it. And then everybody's like, oh, that's interesting. And you're like, seriously? Did you see me over here? Didn't I just say that? And so you start having a conversation with colleagues, so then they start doing it. I now have colleagues who'll say, well, that's Hilary's point. To take it back to what I just said, to call out other people in the room. And that's what we all need to be doing for each other. I am clueless in other areas. I'm sure you guys all saw, or some of you saw, the Colin Kaepernick ad that Nike put out. And I was so proud of all of that creative work, but there was one still where the copy said, I'm going to get it wrong, I'm sure, but it was close to, stand for something, even if it means sacrificing everything, right? And while I am the executive sponsor of the Nike Military Veterans Network, I am not myself a veteran, and I missed that language was very, very close to the ultimate sacrifice. So when we went out with that ad campaign, there were veterans who thought we were diminishing or trying to create a parallel with Colin Kaepernick being unable to play and people giving their lives on the field of battle. That was not what that was about. But because we didn't have a veteran read the copy, nobody saw it. It was an unintentional miss. This is why we all have to be educated by each other all the time. It's not male and female, people of color or not. Every stripe has issues, and we need the diversity and getting people's voices at the table, because we're going to see things. I'm going to see some things, and I'm going to miss important other things only based on my life experience. And so I don't think that's a woman thing. I just think that's a life thing, and we'll do better for each other and our work environments and the next generation if people are just more open about talking about these things and about the importance of getting disparate points of view on a single subject at the table in order to inform better decision making.
What career advice would you give, either for someone who wants to become a GC or more generally someone who's graduating law school?
So I think if you want to go in-house, it's the same advice for if you don't. Go kill it at your first job. Head down, kill it. Most people don't hire into in-house practices directly. Most people want to see law firm experience. And there's no substitute for excellence at everything you undertake. You guys all obviously understand that, or you wouldn't be sitting in the chairs you're sitting in. So you get it. Keep that up. Have an area of focus. Pay attention to the people you work with. Make sure you're working with people who you respect, both intellectually and their ethics. It can take years to build a reputation. You can lose it very quickly. And if you're working with the wrong people, you might not get a good sixth sense. So I would pay attention to who you surround yourself with. I would be curious. I would ask your clients about their jobs, how they got them, what they like about them, what they don't like about them. We're all different people. And so we're all going to have different things that are going to influence what we want to do. Be curious about the people around you. They can tell you a lot that can help inform you and your path forward, because there's no single path to success. The greatest path to success is matching your passion with the work you do so that you have the energy to get up and do it, because practicing law is hard and it requires a lot of time and it requires a lot of dedication, and it can be incredibly rewarding. But if you're not feeling it and you're grinding it out because you think it's something you should do, I think that's going to end up being career limiting. So find your own passion and keep going after it. And along the way, work hard and be excellent.
In terms of, there are challenges along the way. What kept you motivated throughout your career, maybe earlier on, and how has it changed?
I love it. I love the law. I come from a legal family, so maybe you would say I was born into it. I started as a litigator. My husband's favorite joke is, thank God we found someone to pay her to argue. And there's some truth to that. It's a natural fit for me. And I did make good decisions about where I worked. And I am a person who likes new challenges, so I would leap to new things. And that was good for me because it kept me engaged. On the other side of it, I had a husband who was an academic and we had 3 kids. There's just a part of I don't know about all of you, but my life, it wasn't like some grand choice between staying home and decorating the house or going to work. It was I had to go to work. I felt I was pretty lucky to have been given this unbelievable education that allowed me to have super fulfilling work. And I never experienced it as a real opposition to my family life. Everybody wants to talk about work-life balance as if they're opposites pulling against each other. Well, my work enabled my life, and my life helped me do my work. I just didn't experience them as opposites. I tried to integrate them. I had my first child 8 days after I started my job at Skadden. So I was never a lawyer without being a mom, and never a mom without being a lawyer. And so I didn't think about it that way. And whenever I found myself lacking in drive, I was questioning whether I was in the right job, because I naturally have energy and engagement. And the few times I lacked it, it was clear that it was time for me to make a change.
What do you think are the most important qualities that you have that make you successful in what you do?
I'm empathetic, getting back to your EQ question.
Yeah.
So I can put myself in somebody else's position, and that helps both in advising a client, okay? It helps in coaching lawyers who work for me. It helps in putting yourself in the position of other business leaders. It just helps all over the place. I have cultivated an ability to listen carefully. And I had to cultivate that because I started out wanting to talk more and listen less. But I went to classes on active listening. I really paid attention to the feedback people gave me in my career, starting very early. And one of the biggest compliments I got was maybe my second year when I was in my review, and they said, the best thing about you is when we give you feedback, it's clear you take it and you internalize it and you try to act on it. And just that person taking the moment to tell me they recognize that quality in me made me recognize that quality in myself and double down on it. So when people give you feedback, human reaction is no. That's criticism. Oh, I don't like to hear it. God, it's the biggest gift they can give you. Usually they're right, even if you don't want to accept it. So I would encourage you to pull that stuff in. I also have a fair amount of courage. I'm willing to say things. I've always been willing to say things that other people aren't willing to say, even if they're thinking it. And I think that's an unusually important characteristic for somebody in my role, is just being able to always say the truth. And part of that is I've never allowed myself to have any debt. I always approached my job every day as, once I went in-house, as, am I good to be fired today? And I had to be in a position that I was okay being fired any day, that I didn't have economic burdens that would make me adjust my advice for fear of the consequence it could have. And I think that always having that gave me a lot of security and confidence to say what had to be said And I think people actually appreciate somebody who's willing to do that. And so in the end of the day, it's always ended up being an asset, not a liability, but you never know. And you have to be prepared for the liability side where you say one thing too many and they're like, yeah, no, thank you. And not being scared of what was going to happen in my life if that happened. Like, oh, I can't lose my job, my mortgage is too big. Like, yeah, no, I really spent a lot of time making sure that there were never going to be any economic reasons that would cause me to compromise on my judgment. And I've appreciated that. I think it actually was probably a huge contributor to my success.
We don't have so much time, so I just have a few questions left.
Okay.
One of them is, so now you've had a legal career that spanned 30 years at this point.
Yeah.
So looking back,
she had to do that, didn't she? I was going to go for 15. Sorry.
So I'm curious, like the ways that you've seen maybe the legal field change over time.
Mm-hmm. So it definitely, over this 30-year period, in-house departments have gotten much bigger and more prevalent and powerful than they were before. There's just a growth of doing things inside. Outside firms are really expensive. The demands are great. In-house jobs have become more attractive, so you can build significant departments in-house to get things done, and that's been a dramatic change. Also, I would say the consolidation of law firms has been a huge change. You know, when I started, like the great merge-a-thon had not begun. And it used to be that, you know, people joined a firm and like you work your way through and you make partner and you stayed there. And now, you know, firms merge, practices, buy and sell. It's a much more fluid situation than it was when I started. I think in the end, that's probably good. I haven't been in a firm since it's been in that environment, but I think the fluidity probably creates more choice for everyone. I will say this, there's a reason there's lawyer jokes out there, okay? People sometimes experience lawyers as arrogant and talking down to them, and they still do. Okay, and so there is a little bit like, do we need to have the lawyer, you know? That's still out there to some extent. And so this goes again to the emotional intelligence. It does well to pay attention to overcoming that and to not showing up. Like, you know, and this is a dumb example, but it's true. Lawyers tend to lead with their credentials. You know, you can work it in where you went to law school in the first 5 minutes. You know, to most of the rest of the world, they're like, oh, please stop. I just don't need your Ivy League credentials in the first 5 minutes. There is this feeling of there's an assumed condescension. So just play against type. Like, if we all do better, we can get rid of that, and then you'll have more influence. But that's always been there, and it's still there. Maybe even a little bit worse.
Some quick lighter questions. One is, you've said that you really like sport metaphors.
Yes.
What are some of your favorites?
Oh, I like people who punch above their weight class. You know, that's a good one. I like, my favorite one is the one we use as the analogy for my whole department, okay? So it's American football. So for those of you who don't know American football, sorry, but here you go. Like the legal department, we are not the quarterback, we're not the wide receiver, we're not the playmaker. We do not put points up on the board, okay? Those are the business executives. We're the offensive line. We're the people who line up in front of the playmakers and create space on the field so that they can execute their plays and move forward and put points on the board. And there is no decent football team in the world where the offense would huddle without their offensive line. Because if they did, they'd never execute plays, their quarterback would get sacked all the time, and they would never win. So the offensive line, they're never the stars of the show, and they don't try to be. But without them, the whole operation falls apart. And so that's what I've told my people. I'm like, go out there, understand the plays that our business people want to execute, and figure out how you're going to run ahead of them and create space and remove obstacles for them to be successful. And that's my all-time favorite because it works, and it was the one that got all of the business people at Nike to say, yeah, I'll have a lawyer at my table. I wouldn't huddle without my offensive line. That'd be stupid. And so they all jumped on board, and that was fantastic. The other one, which is just funny because I get to have a big brag and it shows a funny thing about Nike. We had a case in front of the Supreme Court, I forget what year it was decided in, maybe 2015. So we argued and everybody thought, and we won the case 9-0 in the Supreme Court, okay? Anybody who's a lawyer knows, okay, who's practiced, if you win 9-0, it means the court didn't really think they should have granted certiorari. It was probably a mistake in granting certiorari. Wasn't that close a question, but they answered it anyway. It's just not the greatest win. The greatest win for a lawyer is the 5-4 win. It was a jump ball and you prevailed, right? Not at Nike. They're like, 9-0, woohoo! Because we keep score, right? And so all of the business people thought 9-0 was great, and all of the lawyers were like, yeah, that was just improvidently granted under a different heading. So pretty funny.
If you were to ever, if you ever had a podcast that was not about the law, what would it be on?
Oh man, not about the law. What would it be on? Probably wilderness, hiking in the woods. I spend a lot of time in wilderness, and I'm a great believer in time in nature is the best antidote to stress and where I get my most creative thinking done. So it would probably be a podcast about hiking.
So do you set aside time for that?
Yes, you bet. Yes, I do. I'm out in the woods almost every weekend. I find that's another thing. Invest in those things that reduce stress for you. Figure out good workout habits and take care of them. Know what your go-to place is to relieve stress in your life, because you can't control the amount that comes in, but you can control how you handle it. And the earlier you get healthy patterns in that regard, the better you'll do. It is a stressful profession.
There's so many things I would want to ask you as a final question, but maybe what are you most looking forward to in the future?
Oh, wow. Grandkids. Now that you've already outed me for how old I am, I have kids in my 20s. The eldest is 29. None of them are even in really serious relationships with anybody. But I'm still sitting here and like, where are my grandkids? I want to have a baby that's not mine. That's the truth. That is the most honest truth. I'm also looking forward to the future at Nike. I think we've got a great next chapter ahead of us, and I've never been disappointed. It's a company that's very focused on the future, and it's exciting to see what's coming. And so being a part of that until my grandkids come, that'll have to keep me occupied.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and thank you to all of you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.